Thank you, Gary. So forgive me for a slightly early finish. If I can ask a favour, if at 10:27 I'm still going strong, please can someone remind me that I have to stop because I need to finish a couple of minutes early. Okay, so we'll go straight into the Gemara on the top of Ayin Hey Omod Aleph, which is a continuation of the sugya of Tofer, the melachot of Tofer. And I'm afraid I found this little short sugya that was left over a lot harder than I thought I would. So apologies in advance for what I think is not going to be as clear a sugya as it should have been. I'm struggling a little bit with it. The Gemara says literally a 7-word sugya. Omar Rav Zutra Batuvia, Omar Rav, Mote'ach chut shel tefira b'Shabbos chayev chatos. Someone who stretches or tenses a thread of sewing on Shabbos is chayev chatos. Now, by this stage in our learning, we know what the Gemara is saying. If you tighten or stretch the thread, chayev chatos, translation, this is a melacha min haTorah. We're not in the world of draponans over here. We're talking about a melacha min haTorah. The Gemara then goes on and says other statements from Rav Zutra Batuvia, which we'll, Emir Hashem, learn in future weeks. Fascinating, more Agoda Gemara about magic and Babylonian superstitions that were around, the Mote'ach, and so on. But that's not our focus for today's shiur. So what is this malacha of Mote'ach chut shel tefira, one who stretches or tenses a thread of sewing? So Rashi on the sugya, it says as follows: Beged hatofel v'omed. We're talking about an already sewn beged. V'hiniach hachut oruch. He left the thread overly long. And therefore the two parts of the garment separated. So picture a seam where the thread has gone a little loose, or Rashi seems to say not that it's gone a little loose, but it never was tight enough on the first place, and therefore there's slack in the thread, and therefore the two pieces of the garment separate a little bit because of the slack in the thread. So this person pulls the thread and tightens it in order to bring the two pieces of the garment back together. He pulls the threads in order to stick them together, to press them together and to join them. Zuhi tefiraso. This is his tefira, the chayev, and therefore the person who did this is chayev for melacha on Shabbos. So Rashi learns that we're talking here about tightening the thread on Shabbos. You have an already sewn garment and you're tightening the thread. So let's just spend a few moments thinking about Rashi. Is there anything missing in Rashi in order to do the melacha? Or does Rashi describe the melacha in totality? So first of all, how do we understand that it's a melacha? Well, Rashi's understanding seems to be quite intuitive. We understand both the chiddush of the Gemara and also why this is a reasonable chiddush to say. We've already learned that sewing tofer on Shabbos is a melacha. By weaving the stitches in and out, you're doing a melacha. So now we have an interesting shaila. What happens if the threads are already woven in and out, but they're loose, and therefore they don't succeed in doing what threads are meant to do, which is bring a garment together? And you tighten the threads. So you don't do the actual intersection of the threads in and out. You just tighten them. Is that enough to be the melacha or not? Says Rashi in the Pshat in the Gemara that this is the melacha. This is also the melacha of Tofer on Shabbos, and therefore you are chayev. So we hear the chiddush of the Gemara. This isn't obvious because you've in a sense only done part of the melacha. All you've done is the tightening, not the actual weaving of the thread in and out. On the other hand, we understand the chiddush. We can comprehend why the Gemara says this chiddush, because this is part of the melacha. Now, we already learned in the previous sugya that to be chayev on the melacha of Tofer, one has to do a minimum of shtei tefiras, 2 stitches, or more accurately, actually, that means 1 in and 1 out. And in addition, one has to do a kasher. Why does one have to do shtei tefiras? Because that's the shear of Tofer. Why does one have to do a knot off the ends of the threads? Because otherwise it's not a melacha shel kayama, it's not miskayemes. The tefira doesn't have enough of a permanence to it. We also saw in the Rishonim that if you achieved other ways of permanence for the stitching, for example, doing more than one in and out, which is quite loose, but you did several in and outs, such that the tension pulls in different directions now, where it would have some degree of permanence even without a knot, that would also be enough. So Rashi over here doesn't mention any of these conditions. Rashi just says you tighten the thread. So there's two ways to understand Rashi. Either Rashi is talking about part of the original stitching process, because after all, Rashi says, if we're medayik in the language of the Rashi, he says, you left the thread long. In other words, we're not talking about where it's become loose over time because the thread has stretched. We're talking about where the thread was never tightened from the start. So we're talking about someone mid-stitching process. So since they're mid-stitching process, by tightening the thread, they are completing the melacha, and therefore that's enough to be chayav. And therefore Rashi simply isn't going into the lomdos of what you would require for stitching. If you want to know what sort of stitching I'm talking about, well, that's the last sugya. That's the bottom of Ayin Daled Amud on base, in which we need to learn how to do the melacha of stitching. All Rashi is saying now is if you don't do the actual in and out, but you just do the tightening, that's also enough for the melacha.
Rabbi, sorry, how do we know that Rashi is talking about a stitch that was never tightened in the first place?
I'm not sure, but it seems to me that's the language of Rashi, because Rashi says "Bega tatofur v'omeid." Sorry, I should say more precisely. Not necessarily never tightened in the first place, but the string was never made to the right length in the first place. Because Rashi says it's "Bega tatofur v'omeid." You left the thread too long. In other words, it's not that over time it became separated because of stretching, but the thread was never the right length thread. So you're correct to pick me up on this because I should have phrased my words more clearly. It's not that it was never tightened. On the contrary, Rashi says it's tough over omed, it was sewn, but it was never completely correctly sewn because the stitching was left overly long.
It sounds like there should be a bit more like makeba patish in a way, because if that exists within a melacha, because he's just really finishing off the actual melacha that was started.
Makeba patish is every melacha could be argued to be makeba patish because we're always completing something. So arguably, every time I weave a garment, it's makeba patish. Every time I build a building, it's makeba patish. Every time I bake a cake, it's makeba patish. So what defines something as makeba patish and what defines it as another melacha? So there's several possible answers to this question, ranging from enochanami, if it's the last stitch of a garment, it would also be makeba patish. But who says we're talking about the last stitch in the garment over here? Maybe I'm at the beginning of making a garment, and I've still got another 3 feet of cloth to sew together before my fabric's properly joins. And we're just talking about the first little bit of stitching, in which case makeba patish isn't relevant. But enochanami, you're correct. The last stitch would also be makeba patish. That's one extreme. To another extreme that would say that we saw Pnei Yeshua, who argued that makeba patish has to be something which by definition is a completion and different to the rest of the process, but something which is merely a continuation of the process and the last step, but identical to everything that's gone before, wouldn't be makeba patish. Or indeed, makeba patish is a term only appropriate, it's only the definition of melacha when it is no other melacha. When it's another melacha, then the achievement is more specific than makeba patish. It's baking a cake, it's cooking a dish, it's weaving a garment, and therefore makeba patish wouldn't be the right term. Makeba patish is when it's no other melacha other than completing something. So if I pump up a flat-packed leather football, pumping things up is no melacha other than completing the football, and therefore this would be makeba patish. So makeba patish here isn't relevant because either because of the general principles of makeba patish, or because who says this is completing the garment at all? It's finishing the stitching, this particular little patch of stitching, but lav dafka, not necessarily is it finishing the stitching of the whole garment.
Doesn't it have to be done with a needle?
No, not necessarily. We don't find there's such a condition in Tofer. On the practical level, in order to get the thread in and out, you would normally need a needle. But
right.
Tofer can also take place in fact, this is relevant to our topic. We'll get to this. If you have in fact, I think we dealt with this in the previous sugya. If you have like a hoodie of the sort, which has a cloth, a string that runs through it, and you tighten the string in order to close the hoodie, that wouldn't be a malacha because it's designed to be open and closed the whole time. But were one have to have a garment as they used to have in the past, where the tightening was done as a one-off, then you wouldn't be allowed to tighten this. We spoke about, I think, sleeve endings. In the pre-elasticated world, there was always a problem. How do you make garments, and a pre-elasticated world and a pre-buttoned world, how do you close garments? And they used to use, if you think about Elizabethan dress and so on, they used to use a cord that ran through the ends of the sleeve, and they used to tighten that to grip around the wrist and so on. So in that context, the place can discuss Tofer and actually also Masechet Shabbat. But there's no needle that's used. It's just wound through a little bit like through eyelet holes where the thread is round through the hole without a needle. So in principle, a needle is not necessary. Other than a practical thing, and therefore, if you do something that needs a needle without a needle, maybe there'd be a use of shunoi. It's not integral to the definition of the malacha.
When Rashi says that he says Rashi Hachut, but does that mean both ends of the thread, and does that imply that neither end is knotted?
So I have to be honest, I haven't noticed this diuk of Rashi Hachut, and I should have noticed it, so I stand corrected. So I don't want to comment on it without thinking it through. The Ran sort of picks up on this issue. In a minute we're going to see the Ran, but I hadn't, poorly so, I hadn't noticed this use of the language of Rashi. I don't know if it implies anything about knotting, but I'm actually now wondering, why does Rashi say Rashi Hachut? Imagine you have a very lengthy bit of thread weaving in and out, and just one bit of it has gone loose, and you just tighten that little bit of it. Why would that be enough? Why do you need Rashi Hachut at all? So either Rashi is just giving a practical example, which if you pull the ends of the threads, or for some reason Rashi thinks this is halachically significant. I don't know, and I don't comment because I missed that diuk.
And the Mishnah Berurah says Rosh Hachut. Mishnah Berurah says Rosh Hachut. They're different. Some say Rashi, some say Rosh.
Yes, the Mishnah uses the same language. But I assumed he was just sort of cutting and pasting from the language of the Rishonim.
He doesn't, because he says Rosh. He doesn't say Rashi. I'm saying there's a difference.
Oh, in my prints he says Rashi. Okay, so.
Oh, okay. Not in. Okay, fair enough.
That's very interesting. Okay, I don't know. I'll have to look at the text of the Mishnah Berurah to say Rosh.
I thought it was Rosh actually. When I looked at it. Anyway.
What I'm looking at here says Rashi. How interesting. Okay, so Paul, I'm going to put
can I just
on hold and I need to reflect on it. I don't want to comment on it without thinking about it. Sorry, Elio, were you saying something?
Yeah, sorry. Just to go back to the first way you were trying to learn Rashi, where you were suggesting he was in the middle of stitching, he hadn't quite finished, and he pulled it tight. And then somebody asked, hang on a second, we see that it already is tight because it says Bag Tofer Va'omed, and then it also says V'chut Feres Nimshochem, they became loose. So we're talking about somebody who's, so I'm just trying to understand what your first derech in Rashi actually is.
Yeah, my language was imprecise, but Rashi, he says v'niach hachut aruch, he left the thread overly long. So it does sound like it was initially tightened, but then the thread, I shouldn't have said it was left loose, I should have said it was left overly long in Rashi. And again, I don't know why Rashi says that, rather than saying it was stretched and became loose over time. So whether Rashi means that as a diuk, that's part of the process of the tefillah, that the tefillah was never completed properly, or whether Rashi means that it was, just Rashi means practically that's how it became loose over time. I don't know. But the point I was bringing out is that the original tefillah was done in a poor manner, that it wasn't, the thread that was used was overly long. And the reason I'm stressing this point is because of the issue I wanted to get to, which is, well, what happened here with the Shiur of the Rashi Hachutim? Were these heads of the stitches knotted or not?
Couldn't Heniach Hachut Aroch mean the long thread that was being used to make the knotting, the stitching, rather than it's been left long, but it's the long thread that's been used to do the job has not been sewn in or tied in a knot at the end?
No, because, and this is a language point, because then the hey hayudia, the hey, you can say hachut aruch or chut ha'aruch. If the aruch was a labeling of the thread, then it would say chut ha'aruch, the long thread. When it says v'niach hachut aruch, it translates as he left the thread long, as opposed to he left the long thread. So yeah.
I thought that myself, but I wanted to give it a go.
No, I'm sorry, I don't go with that one. Yeah.
In terms of your question, does the fact that it says Begad Tofer Omed, does the Omed not mean that it had achieved some sort of Kayama? And indeed, I think in the Rambam in source 4 you've given, he talks about the Shekosha Rashi Achut Mikan Kadei Sheta Amod Tfira. So it seems that Amod is a parallel phrase to Kayama, and that it was either it did have knots or it had enough stitches in it that it didn't need knots.
So yes and no. The no part is that it's not clear at all if the Rambam is inhabiting the same sugya as Rashi. In other words, does he come with the same basic translation as Rashi in the sugya and then have a halachic discussion about how he learns it, or whether he has a completely different understanding of the sugya? And we'll get to that, I guess, probably next year. In terms of your other point, again, and I apologize for this because Karen correctly picked me up on this. My language that I used at the beginning was not precise. My point was not meant to be, and I drifted into saying this wrongly. My point was not meant to be that no sewing had happened at all in Rashi's Pshat and the Sugya. My point was simply that the core of the problem was because the thread was left too long, and therefore the melacha was never done initially in a way that there was something seemingly incomplete in how the melacha was done. It would have been incorrect to say, and I said this, misphrased this, to say that the tefira was never complete at all, because Rashi says that it was tofer over omed. I simply meant to say that for some reason, Rashi says that the chut was left too long, as opposed to it becoming loose over time. Now, whether Rashi just means that as a practical example, why would it need tightening because the chut was left too long, or whether Rashi is saying something significant, I don't know. But I belabor this point because it's going to be relevant as to whether the ends of the chut are knotted or not. I've confused everyone here by my poor use of language at the beginning of the sugya. I said the hakira too extreme. My point is whether it was ever tightened or not in the thread, and rather than whether the garment, the cloths were ever brought together, which Rashi says clearly they were. So I said that too. I phrased it very poorly.
Can I just ask on one other question on Rashi? When he says and he uses the word miktsas in Rashi, do you understand that to mean miktsas, an edge? Or do you understand it to mean that across the whole of the seam, it's a little bit loose?
I understood it to be a little bit loose rather than the edge, just because of the style of what the language looks like to me.
Okay.
But again, I'm not 100% sure. And I'm not sure exactly why Rashi says this for miktsas either. I mean, if it becomes very loose, is it different to a tiny bit loose? Or is Rashi's point to bring out the chiddush of the halacha that obviously if it's so loose that the two cloths have become completely separate and then I tighten it, obviously that's tofer. But here, even when it's become a little bit loose and I just tighten it a little bit, even that's tofer. That's why Rashi writes the miktsas in order to emphasize the chiddush over here of the halacha. That again, I was going to come to the concept a bit later, but your question makes us focus on the concept already now. There's 2 points really about the chiddush of the sugya. One is that I'm not weaving the thread in and out; it's already gone in and out. All I'm doing is tightening. And the second one is it makes us think about what a join means. If the melach of tofer is joining two pieces together, then, well, even when it's a little loose, it still joins together. If you have a garment where the seams are splitting a bit because it's got old or you've put on a little bit of weight, it's still joined. The cloths are still joined. They've just got a little looser than they originally were. So it seems that that's an aspect of the chiddush of the sugya, that even a tightening from somewhat connected to very connected is enough to make it the melacha. And that's what I understood the b'mitzvahs of Rashi to me, and I don't have a proof for that, but that's what it seems to me the language Rashi was saying.
It seems to me that if it wasn't loose at all and you just tugged it, then you haven't done anything, and therefore it couldn't be a melacha.
Yes, that way around is true. If it's not loose at all, it can't be a melacha. But Rashi's chiddush, I'm suggesting, is also the other way around. That it's not only a melacha when it's completely loose, it's even a melacha when it's partially loose. Now, what exactly the boundary between miktsas is, I don't know. This really brings out why I was struggling in the sugya. Because if we look at Rashi of Mote'ach shel Tefira, every single word in this Rashi basically should be underlined, because every single word is meduyuk. Rashi is saying a very specific explanation of what this scenario is, and we are left struggling to understand which aspects of this explanation are halachically crucial and which aspects are just Rashi explaining the scenario. And each one has ramifications. So Rashi says, Begad hatafel v'omed. Who asked Rashi to say that? Maybe it's not yet tafel v'omed. Maybe it's talking about tightening and when it's not tafel v'omed. Let me give you an example. Erev Shabbos, 3 minutes before Shabbos, I'm quickly finishing off my sewing. I leave the threads in and out. Then I realize I've run out of time. Shabbos is coming. I light my Shabbos candles and I haven't yet tightened the thread. Shabbos night, I forget it's Shabbos and I tighten the threads. Who asked Rashi to say it's a Begad hatafel v'omed? So that's the first diuk of Rashi. Then Rashi says, V'niach achot orach. He left the thread over long. So this was our second diuk of Rashi. Who says the thread was left long? Maybe it became loose over time. Is that important to Rashi or not important to Rashi? Then Rashi says, they become somewhat separated. What's this somewhat over here in the diuk? Then he says the threads of the stitching become stretched out. It's every line of it. Then he says, so again, we don't know why does Rashi say Roshei HaChut? Why does he say the heads of the chut? Why doesn't he say the threads itself? So in the seemingly, 5-7 word sugya, which I came into thinking would be a very brief share, it's occurred to me that we simply don't know what every word of Rashi is problematic. Not problematic, but every word of Rashi is difficult to know what's important here or not. And if you're hoping that I've got some wonderful chiddush to tell you to answer all of this, I'm not to this point. I do not. I don't know. Some of the diukim we have something about. And we're going to have a look at the Shiur Laran, who makes some comments. We're going to have a look at the Mishnah Berurah and the Shahar Tziyun, who make some comments. But a large part of this Rashi remains mysterious. And each diuk, we could come up with the lomdas to explain it. In other words, you could come up with a concept to understand why this is important in the melacha. Maybe Rashi is saying it's only if it became separated after it was already sewn that it would be a melacha. But if it was part of the sewing process, it wouldn't be a melacha because it's a continuation. Maybe Rashi is saying it's only where the chiddush of Rashi is, even where it was never done properly because the thread was left long, as opposed to if it became stretched over time, in which case, obviously now it's become changed in the quality of the sewing and you're re-sewing it. So why is it Roshei HaChut? Is that Rashi's attempt to answer the problem of the kasha or not? Every aspect of this it remains unclear, and you can imagine scenarios where this would be important. Halacha l'maisa. You could have situations where you're tightening the thread, where if some of our diukim are correct, it wouldn't be a malacha. In other cases, where you're tightening threads, where if our diukim are correct, it would be the malacha. So I don't really have answers to any of these diukim, other than to point out that almost every word in Rashi is interesting and not intuitive. It's not how we would have written Rashi on the sugya. Even if we're broadly going with Rashi's malach of trying to understand it. I want to, just for the sake of I'm running out of time. I just want, for the sake of we should maybe just try and have a very quick look at the Shiur Laran before we stop today. By the way, it's known as the Shiur Laran. I put in brackets Miyuchas Laran. Miyuchas means ascribed to the Ran. If you look in old Sforim, this was known as Chedushei Haran, the commentary of the Ran on Shabbos. In recent years, very significant doubts have been raised about whether this really came from the Ran or not, and if it's been renamed the Miyuchas Ran, the commentary that's ascribed to the Ran, even though it may not be the Ran himself. Nonetheless, we treat it as a serious halachic source because it certainly dates from the times of the Rishonim. It's clear that it was from a very learned Rishon, and it's also clear that throughout the generations, the poskim took it seriously as a halachic source. So even though it's probably not the Ran, but it's in Miyuchas Ran, we take it as an important halachic source. Not every manuscript, by the way, found from the times of the Rishonim has authority as a Rishon. Just like nowadays, there are more and less learned people. Presumably in the times of the Rishonim, there were less learned figures who lived at the time of the Rishonim who weren't senior rabbinic leaders and nonetheless had some writings which, for whatever reason, were preserved. But the assumption is that manuscripts that came down through the generations and were learned seriously through the generations, even if we don't know, in this case, who the author was, nonetheless are taken seriously. I'm afraid we've run out of time due to my need to early finish today, and I apologize. So I'm going to actually relook at this Rashi again because I missed some of the diukim, and Emir Hashem on Tuesday we will learn and relook at the Rashi again and see if we can get a better understanding of the language. And also I'm going to put on hold the issue of live share for a couple more weeks whilst we look into things, and then get back to whether I'll also go live. But the share will definitely also continue via Zoom. But whether we also switch to live or not, we'll review again in a little bit of time. I wish everyone a good day, and thank you so much as always for joining.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Very good.
All right, lovely to
Well,
see
thank you
everyone
very
back.
much. Yeah.
Thank you.